At 38, exhaustion is written all over his face. At 22, he ignored the first signs of tiredness. At 38, stress feels constant. At 22, he said yes to everything. At 38, his mind feels empty. At 22, he never gave it rest. At 38, he sits alone in silence. At 22, he chased endless productivity. At 38, even peace feels heavy. At 22, sleep was always sacrificed. At 38, his thoughts feel slow. At 22, he overloaded his brain daily. At 38, pressure surrounds him. At 22, he never set limits. At 38, emotions feel drained. At 22, he worked without pause. At 38, his eyes show fatigue. At 22, nights were never enough for rest. At 38, frustration builds quietly. At 22, he skipped every break. At 38, even sitting feels exhausting. At 22, he pushed past every limit. At 38, focus disappears easily. At 22, mental health was ignored. At 38, chaos surrounds his work. At 22, he took on too much. At 38, he feels mentally stuck. At 22, he chased hustle without thinking. At 38, he feels nothing inside. At 22, he ignored burnout completely. At 38, mornings feel heavy. At 22, nights were never for rest. At 38, work feels overwhelming. At 22, he never stopped working. At 38, loneliness feels real. At 22, he isolated himself for work. At 38, silence feels loud. At 22, relaxation didn't exist. At 38, emotions overflow quietly. At 22, he never slowed down. At 38, screens feel draining. At 22, breaks were never taken. At 38, thoughts feel scattered. At 22, balance never mattered. At 38, he feels trapped. At 22, he overcommitted constantly. At 38, stress feels permanent. At 22, he chased endless goals. At 38, burnout feels real. At 22, it was just beginning. At 38, the mess reflects his mind. At 22, late nights felt normal. At 38, deadlines feel suffocating. At 22, he took on too much work. At 38, emotions feel drained. At 22, he ignored every warning sign. At 38, fatigue never leaves. At 22, rest was never a priority. At 38, his expression is empty. At 22, he never stopped pushing. At 38, his mind feels tired. At 22, productivity was everything. At 38, life feels empty. At 22, personal life was ignored. At 38, silence surrounds him. At 22, he worked in isolation. At 38, stress becomes normal. At 22, breaks felt like weakness. At 38, pressure feels unbearable. At 22, he said yes to everything. At 38, nights feel endless. At 22, bad routines were built. At 38, he feels drained inside. At 22, self-care was ignored. At 38, his mind feels blank. At 22, he worked without purpose. At 38, emotions feel heavy. At 22, he pushed too far. At 38, life feels like a trap. At 22, stress became a habit.
If this video opened your eyes, make sure you subscribe, because what you learn today can save your future tomorrow.